So remember when I brought up how controversial the last episode was? Well, this episode,
entitled Horn Sweet Horn,
beats it by a landslide, and I kinda have to address it now. A lot of people think this episode is about transgenderism. I disagree, and not just because somebody I happen to associate with thinks it's not about transgenderism. I do think that there are elements of identity crisis, and certainly transgender people could be able to relate to elements of this episode, but I don't think that's specifically what they were going for when they wrote it. I'm going to point out places where the transgender analogy doesn't work. You can take that as saying these are elements where the transgender analogy is bad, but I think it's elements where they clearly weren't intending to have a transgender analogy in the first place.
We open with the narrator again. He's explaining what we can plainly see.
He's got 3 lines in this episode, and all but one of them is completely pointless. Really confused as to why they aren't using the narrator more effectively if they're using him less. The episodes where we don't have the opening narration really do open very well, but when they do have the narrator, it just feels like it was tacked on because they're concerned that children aren't going to be entertained for a couple of seconds. Guys, children will be okay with a steady shot for 1 or 2 seconds. It'll be fine. Trust me. It'll be good.
Anyway, gag about a guy getting eaten by a snake. Bubbles asks about when they get to see a unicorn and gets laughed at since unicorns obviously don't exist.
This establishes the conflict between Bubbles and the rest of society. That is going to indicate her later motivations.
And she has a horn that's apparently a unicorn call?
Looks like she got the thing from a cereal box or something.
It sounds like a kazoo, so naturally Bubbles gets laughed at.
Look, to be fair, I'd be laughing too if you played a kazoo in front of me and told me you were summoning a goddamn unicorn!
Some guy says something about Bigfoot.
It comes up for a gag later that really isn't all that funny.
And then the class goes to the gift shop. Of course, Bubbles goes in the opposite direction.
Even though, she'd probably get in trouble for separating from the rest of the group. It's probably a different episode.
Anyway, a horse with a stick on its head shows up when Bubbles blows on the kazoo thing again, and Bubbles naturally thinks it's a unicorn. We get an extended and confusing explanation about horse etymology for some reason.
Education? Except the girls don't know what they're talking about either. Was this supposed to be a joke? Because, if I can barely tell it's supposed to be a joke, then you have failed at making a joke. I'm sorry.
Buttercup knocks off the horse's fake horn, and he goes on a rant about how he knows in his heart that he's a unicorn, even though he doesn't have a horn.
Even though the etymology thing establishes that he's a baby horse, at least the girls think he's a baby horse, it's indicating he's similar to what an actual baby horse would look like in this universe. Therefore, he probably would either have no horn or a very small horn.
They also notice he can talk,
which, based on their reaction, is not normal for horses in this universe. So Donnie has a biological difference from regular horses, and a significant one in that he can use vocal cords. Okay, no offense, don't take this the wrong way, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in the majority of transgendered cases, it's not a male thinking he's a female because he can lactate and give birth. Okay, well, male lactation is actually a thing. Maybe that's a... My point still stands!
Bubbles offers to get the professor to turn Donnie into an actual unicorn, and the dialogue shows Donnie's naivete and optimism, while it shows Bubbles' real motivation, respect.
In other words, it's pretty well established right from the start that Bubbles is in the wrong because of her selfish motivations.
Then a scene about pickles. It takes about 30 seconds and just establishes a setting for later.
For that matter, the setting, this entire scene for that matter, could have been put into the scene later. It just disrupts the flow in a bad way here.
Turns out the professor can help because he has a transmogrifying ray, but it hasn't been tested.
And once again, we can notice that Bubbles is kind of being selfish since she's more concerned about her own needs, reacting more strongly, than with Donnie's. This kind of goes to serve into something she learns but isn't outright stated in the episode. Yeah, nice touch.
The professor starts putting out a long list of risks involved, which fills the room with how big the document is. Donnie skims over it after the professor tells him to carefully consider it, thus showing his naivete again.
So if this whole episode is an analogy for transgenderism, then what Donnie's doing here is gender reassignment surgery. Not really. You can't really do that on the fly like that. Legally, I mean. Legally, what people would have to do is live as the opposite gender for a certain amount of time. I know that's the case in most states. I don't know if that's the case everywhere. If it's not the case everywhere, please let me know. I'm not an expert on this, but from my understanding, in the vast majority of situations, you do have to take careful thought. You don't just get recommended to by a friend to get it done and immediately have it happen. So yeah, that kind of breaks the analogy as well. It doesn't break it straight up in half, but we'll get to where it gets broken in half.
Surprise! It goes wrong. Donnie now has rabbit ears. Unfortunately, the changes don't stop there, as Donnie starts turning into some sort of monstrous creature. He destroys the machine and declares his hatred for science as he runs through the wall.
This entire scene is relevant to the ending, including the fact that he hates science.
Bubbles follows Donnie to the Pickle Museum. You guys remember the Pickle Museum, right? He throws a mailbox at the Pickle Museum, and inside the mayor is talking about the crystal pickle of despair, which will cause bad luck if it's broken.
I'll give you exactly one guess what happens after he says that. See, this is where I come back to that scene from earlier and why it should have been attached to this scene. When it broke up things there, things didn't need to be broken up. We were progressing through Act 1. Whereas here, we're actually sort of leading to the climax. We're leading towards Act 3, and we're kind of in the middle of Act 2. Things are a little bit intense right now. We could use a little bit more comedy to break things up. And that's why it works better here. It's not like with Escape from Monster Island, where we had an entire subplot that was taking up its own 3 acts. No, this is just a break from intensity. That's it.
Someone calls Donnie a freak, which causes him to delve more into his distraught mindset over his appearance. Bubbles tries to calm down Donnie when he kidnaps the mayor, but he declares that he and Bubbles are no longer best friends.
Bubbles becomes sad, which could indicate one of 2 things, if not both. The first thing it could indicate is that Bubbles wasn't entirely being selfish before. She was concerned about giving Donnie what he wanted. And the other thing that it could indicate, and again, these aren't mutually exclusive really, is that Bubbles realizes she was being selfish earlier and wants to make things right.
Donnie references King Kong, and Bubbles goes up to talk to him again. Bubbles apologizes for her earlier motivations, and Donnie shows his anger at her somewhat selfish motivations, stating that he now believes unicorns are not real.
Wait, I just realized something. If the analogy is supposed to be transgenderism, why are they going with something that the characters in the series think isn't real? I mean, think about it for a second. The only reason to think that Donnie isn't a unicorn at this point is because unicorns aren't real. That's like saying that the only reason to think a transgendered man shouldn't think he's a woman is because women aren't real. That's not how that works. This is more like someone on Tumblr thinking that they're a fire-breathing dragon. Great. I'm gonna get hate comments from Tumblr. Thanks, Powerpuff Girls!
The end of Donnie's short monologue shows that he realizes Bubbles wasn't the only one who was in the wrong, and that he was also incorrect in his assumptions. Bubbles, though, still thinks the unicorns are real. See, she believes that she summoned Donnie with the kazoo thing from earlier.
Sorry. I told you I'd laugh.
Donnie still doesn't believe her and then punches her after some of the most over-the-top dramatization this side of a soap opera. The horn breaks and Donnie realizes he hurt Bubbles and clearly feels remorse for it. He then backs up over the edge of the roof after realizing that he did something that he regretted.
Which indicates that, contrary to what he said during that soap opera bullshit, he's not a monster in his heart like he said he was.
Bubbles wakes up, and just as Blossom is about to tell her what happened to Donnie, we get robbed of the "'twas beauty that killed the beast" line by goddamn unicorns! They catch Donnie with magic lasers and turn him back because blah 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 magic blah blah.
The revelation at this point is that, they just got lost on the way, and, Bubbles' unicorn call, the kazoo, it actually worked!
A callback to the etymology lesson.
You know, because that was entertaining.
Before Bubbles and Donnie both learn a lesson about thinking about the consequences of their action. Oh, yeah, BT dubs, Donnie was totes a unicorn the whole time because one of the unicorns that saved him was his mom.
Turns out he had to go on a... Hang on, this is a quote. An intense journey of adolescent self-discovery. So, puberty? Also, bronies, correct me if I'm wrong here, but, doesn't that also just vaguely describe what Twilight Sparkle had to do to become an alicorn? I mean, again, I might be wrong on that, but let me know. This blows the transgender thing out of the water. I mean, transgender literally means that your mental gender is different from your physical one. Yeah, except for the fact that Donnie mentally thought he was a unicorn, and physically was a fucking unicorn. And it's set up throughout the episode. The fact that he's a baby unicorn means that the horn is small enough to hide under his hair. The fact that the transmogrification ray didn't work, it didn't work because it was trying to turn him into something that he already was. He hates science, of course he does, he's a magical fucking being. It's well set up, and also somewhat unpredictable. And I think, more importantly, this isn't a bad allusion to transgenderism. This makes it to where the illusion isn't even there. Now, like I said, I'm sure there are elements of transgender in it, but it's not meant to straight up be about transgender. It's not straight up meant to be about gender identity. No. I'm gonna leave that flub in. Screw you guys.
Anyway, the unicorns magically fixed the Pickle Museum.
Thus negating the consequences of Bubbles and Donnie's actions, when the moral was outright stated to be that they need to think about the consequences of their actions. Good.
The episode pretty much ends here with another once again the day is saved ending.
And this one was a bit more fitting than the others. They didn't try to tell a new joke and instead expanded on a joke that was already in the episode. The thing they said saved the day actually fucking saved the day. And I like that the catchphrase is actually... It sounds fake, but it's really not. I like that they actually made that the real slogan of the organization. I found that funny. Overall, this episode is... I mean, don't get me wrong, it does better with a tightly weaved narrative, but it's still pretty preachy about that lesson, especially considering they undo the consequences that Bubbles and Donnie were supposed to learn from just because magic. It's not one that I dislike, per se. If this came on TV, I would certainly watch it, but it's not going to be one that I necessarily seek out in order to watch.